between streamers. Yes, and if anyone, yeah, we've got people here now actually watching. If anyone does not know who Aristotle is, you should be following Aristotle because, like, he's the man, and he's a great streamer. Check him out. He does Ask Him Anything, basically, philosophy-wise. So, yeah. And it's a good stream. Knows lots of people, lots of interesting stuff. Does ethics and ancient. So, I mean, does also computer ethics. So you can talk really good stuff about Twitch and all this sort of like this new media things. So, great discussion. But anyway, we're going to talk about Hegel now. Hegel's philosophy of nature is one of the least popular and studied parts of Hegel's legacy. Wow. All right, we're starting off hardcore here. Philosophy of nature is least popular and least studied, I guess. All right, this is what we're doing. We're going into this is throwing down the gauntlet because it's calling out everyone else, saying that no one has looked at this. There we go. Recently, some scholarly attention has turned towards it, and the topics related to it, especially Hegel's account of life, the relationship between his philosophy of nature and his philosophy of spirit, and the bearing between the Hegelian approach to nature on issues of environmental philosophy. For some decades now, there has also been a steady stream of publications, primarily in German, on specific parts of the philosophy of nature, for example, on Hegel's treatment of mechanics and chemistry. You know, it's interesting because chemistry really was picking up at a time when Hegel was around. So, like, and chemistry now is also one of the biggest of sciences because it has so many applications that, yeah. So it's the idea that, like, Hegel was talking about chemistry is probably unsurprising. Like, everyone gets always impressed by the big physics stuff, but chemistry is a lot of where the work is going. So, but like, it's an interesting topic on its own. Outside of physics, outside of biology, it's just fascinating stuff too. Okay, yeah. So, like, there's a philosophy of chemistry. I've never read a philosophy of chemistry paper here. Should go look at that. Anywho. So far, though, few scholars have investigated whether Hegel has anything pertinent to say on various classical topics in the philosophy of science. For example, to the best of my knowledge, it has not been seriously investigated whether Hegel has a position on the problem of scientific realism, that is, on the question of whether entities postulated by our best scientific theories exist, and in what way. In this paper, I will argue that he does indeed have a position on this issue. I document this below in section 2. And that reconstructing it helps a great deal in understanding what Hegel is doing in his philosophy of nature. Okay, interesting. So we've got Hegel and not metaphysics of nature, but philosophy of science here. So that's going to be kind of exciting. I haven't seen a Hegelian philosophy of science. In order to bring the problem of scientific realism into focus and relate to Hegel's concerns, it is helpful to look at Wilfrid Sellars' classic discussion in his essay Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. In this essay, Sellars articulates the concept of scientific and manifest images, argues that they come into conflict, and discusses possible ways to resolve this conflict. Roughly, the manifest image represents the world of our ordinary experience, but it may also include any of its conceptual refinements except for those which are impossible without introducing unobservable objects postulated by scientific theories. That was a wacky sentence. Too many negations. So we've got an impossible without. So this is everything, like everything that we ordinarily see and the things in scientific theories that we can't see, but they're scientific. Okay, so by contrast, the scientific image is an image of the world postulated by such postulated objects, so it's all the scientific-y things. So atoms, quarks, electrons, and so on. Sellars believes that these two images are potentially in conflict and considers three ways to resolve the conflict between them. Firstly, one can think that objects of the manifest image are identical with systems of objects of the scientific image. For example, ordinary material objects are identical with systems of particles. I mean, this is a old thing. Like this pencil here. So you're saying it's a pencil, but what is it really? It's a conglomerations or a grouping of atoms shaped pencil-wise. And so that's kind of what it is. So that would mean they're identical with them. So the pencil here reduces exactly to. It's identical with the objects of the scientific image, which are the particles. Okay? So that's kind of what's going on, just to put it in easier terms. The pencil is really a bunch of atoms arranged pencil-wise. But that's what all a pencil is. That's what they mean by identical with. Secondly, one can argue for the priority of the manifest image. According to the version of this approach that Sellers focuses on, scientific theories are merely tools for better orienting ourselves within the manifest image, and the objects of the scientific image are, as Sellers puts it, abstract or symbolic ways of representing manifest objects. Okay, and this one says, the pencil's the real thing, and we are just organizing our thoughts when we talk about the atoms and stuff, because that gives us an accurate understanding of what the pencil actually is. But the pencil's the real thing. That's the manifest object, and the understanding that we get from atoms and whatnot help us get a very accurate view of the pencil. Okay, finally, and this is the version that Sellers himself prefers, manifest objects can be appearances of the real world that is constituted by the objects of the scientific image. Okay, and that's basically saying the pencil is the pencil, that's how it is in the real world, but it's constituted in some sense, which is not the same way of just being more accurately represented, but in somehow made up metaphysically of the atoms. Okay, in this paper I will show that Hegel defends a peculiar version of the second approach to this problem, that is, of the priority of the manifest image. I mean, that's where you are when you're an idealist. You're going to take the ideas usually as the foundational ones. But anyway, you're not going to default to what like science says. You're going to default to some sort of idealistic idea of the things. By itself, this does not sound surprising, that's what I was saying, and Sellers himself correctly identifies Hegel, albeit in an extremely cursory way, as belonging to the philosophical tradition that insists on the priority of the manifest image. What is interesting here, though, is that Hegel's specific treatment of this position is different, on the one hand, from that of the representatives of many classical philosophical traditions, in that he was confronted with the results of modern science at the relatively advanced stage of its development, living as he did well after the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, and on the other hand, from the approaches of the more recent instrumentalists and other kinds of anti-realists, in that he ascribes scientific results greater metaphysical significance than they do. See, this is what I mean. Hegel's not that old. Like, Hegel was looking at real hardcore science nowadays. Well, not really hardcore science like we know it now, but it was getting there. And so that is interesting that Hegel was really trying to figure stuff out, because he was at the general like upswing of like the scientific worldview. Okay. To anticipate, I believe that Hegel defends the priority of the objects of the manifest image insofar as, on Hegel's view, they possess a certain conceptual articulable structure that relates many general properties that they possess and purports to uncover the relations of dependency between them. I will gradually elaborate on what I take the structure to consist in throughout the course of this paper. Here I will focus on Hegel's philosophy of inorganic nature, because although his account of organic life is of great interest, analyzing it would get us involved in many difficulties, including the relation between the accounts in the logic and in the PN, what is that? Whatever. A different book. Considering Hegel's treatment of inorganic nature is sufficient to make my point. I will first show that Hegel typically criticizes scientists whenever they postulate unobservable entities in their theories. I will then reconstruct Hegel's argument for the irreducibility of material bodies to what can be accounted for mechanically, and conclude with a general characterization of Hegel's resulting account of inorganic bodies in terms of the conceptual structure that allows us to make such bodies intelligible. Okay, so we're going to find out what Hegel thinks of hard science. Hegel on unobservable postulated entities. First of all, it is important to remember the historical context. At the time, the most developed science of the inorganic, for which something like the claims of its universal applicability were made by at least some philosophers, was Newtonian classical mechanics. In addition, there were a number of investigations into specific phenomena such as heat, electricity, magnetism, which were often conducted largely in an empiricist fashion without well-developed theories behind this research, with the exception of optics. See, that's interesting. You have to remember, why were people doing stuff? It was practical. You need optics for both military and, medical purposes. You need it for surveying. You need to make telescopes. You need to make bombs and shoot things at a distance and stuff like that. So there were like these pockets of like super good research, as well as a quickly developing Lavoisierian chemistry. Lavoisier was the start of sort of modern chemistry. They moved away from him very quick, but Lavoisier, what he did was he basically postulated a conservation principle, and that's really what got chemistry off the ground, and everyone knew it at the time too, I think. they the conservation principle basically said that what you have on the left side of an equation in like chemistry is what you're gonna have on the right side. So like you're gonna have these two things combined to make this other thing, and that basically made it so that you no longer had anything mysterious in your chemistry, and so it became much more mathematical at that point. And that's really when chemistry sort of grew up from, well, not grew up, that's unfair, but that's really when people give its like claim to fame of being like a real science as opposed to alchemy. But that's unfair to alchemy, to be honest. Alchemy was actually pretty on top of its stuff, but this Lavoisierian conservation principle basically is what propelled chemistry into like what people think of as like modern chemistry, even though it's a little unfair to the alchemists. Okay, but like this is what I mean. This is like the start of like modern science, or this is how people were viewing it. Okay, the attempts to explain such phenomena often include postulating unobservable entities such as various imponderable fluids, caloric, various electric fluids. Other ways to explain scientific phenomena included resort to hypotheses about the mechanical microstructure of these phenomena. Hegel often criticized both of these approaches. For example, he attacks Newton's account of optical phenomena because Newton's use of the postulated light rays and their bundles, of which light is supposed to consist. The representation of discrete and simple light rays and particles and their bundles out of which light limited its diffusion is supposed to arise belongs to the barbaric usage of the categories, which was made dominant in physics in particular by Newton. So he doesn't like Newton's theory of light. On the other hand, Hegel consistently criticizes appeals to unobservable, imponderable fluids and the like in the explanation of scientific phenomena. For example, he rejects the caloric theory of heat, characterizing caloric as a fiction. Sound and heat do not exist by themselves, as does heavy matter, and the so-called matter of sound and caloric are mere fictions introduced into physics by the metaphysics of the understanding. Sound and heat are conditioned by existing material things and constitute their negativity. They are merely moments, but as determinations of that which is material, they are quantitative, and so have to be determined by degrees. In other words, they are intensive. While this passage has its difficulties, it seems clear that what draws Hegel's criticism is the hypostatization of sound and heat into independently existing things. As Hegel claims here, this hypostatization is due to the metaphysics of the understanding that dominates the sciences. Hegel's own position, by contrast, is that the sound and heat are only moments or determinations of the matter rather than themselves material objects. Well, you know, that sounds like Hegel got it right, actually, because like sound is, of course, like the wavelength, the shaking of the air. So I mean, it's the air, the movement, but it's only a moment of where the air is that's causing it. So it sounds like Hegel had a point there. Okay, but rather than listing the specific examples of Hegel's criticism of the use of unobservable entities postulated for theoretical purposes, it is better to look at the passages in the Logic where he directly speaks about the metaphysics of understanding. Yeah, Valpo, how you doing? The metaphysics of understanding that is typically presupposed in the sciences. Yeah, you know, every so often I just feel like a glutton for punishment, and we're going to do some Hegel. This is Hegel's natural science, actually, which is, I had no idea what we were getting into, but apparently we're going to talk about Hegel's understanding of like the science of his day. Yeah, so I hope you're well. So although atomism is still highly regarded today among those natural scientists who do not want to know anything about metaphysics, it should be remembered in this connection that we do not escape metaphysics, or more precisely, grasping nature in thoughts by throwing ourselves in the arms of atomism, because atom is in fact itself a thought, and so the conception of matter as consisting of atoms is a metaphysical conception. Alright, pause there. It's saying, look, if you can reduce everything down to atoms, that's still the idea that you're reducing it down to an atom, that like idea that there's a like unbreakable little piece at the bottom, that's still a metaphysical conception, that you're getting something reduced down to it. Babel says, Kant was actually scientifically interesting, wrote multiple books about volcanoes. Oh, that's kind of fun. I didn't know he was a volcanologist. I mean, was he making crap up, or was he actually going looking at stuff? I didn't know there were volcanoes out where he was. I didn't even think he went anywhere. So how does he know anything about volcanoes? But that is interesting that he tried. Like, yeah, I thought Kant, like, never left his house. Or, like, never left, like, more than 10 miles from his house. Like, I don't think there's any volcanoes in Germany, but what do I know about Germany, so. Anywho. I mean, what's his name? Guy who wrote Lolita. He was a butterfly specialist. So he wrote, like, nice monographs on, like, butterflies that people still, like, reference. People do stuff. Anywho. Okay, it was theoretical, but not terrible. Good to know. Good to know. I mean, yeah, you can do, like, you can read papers and then, like, you know, do analysis on them, and that's perfectly good work. In the sciences, too. You can do, like, meta-analysis. So, theoretical stuff is good. Even in volcanology. I mean, and granted, who's really doing, to be fair, I bet most of it was theoretical at the time, because what would they actually go study? It's not like they could go into volcanoes, so I'm talking out my butt. Anyhow. Although Newton has explicitly warned physics to be aware of metaphysics to his honor, it must be said that he did not conduct himself in accordance with this warning at all. In fact, only the animals are really pure physicists because they do not think, while man, as a thinking being, is a born metaphysician. The only thing that matters is whether the metaphysics that one employs is of the right kind, and, in particular, whether instead of the concrete logical idea, one holds on to one-sided thought determinations fixed by the understanding so that they form the basis of our theoretical and our practical action. This is the critique that applies to the philosophy of atomism. Principles of the older or the more recent philosophies, be it water or matter or atoms, are thoughts, something universal, ideal, not things. They are immediately encountered, that is, sensuous singularity. No, as they are immediately encountered. Okay. So yeah, so the thing is, it's like the idea is when you just said everything is water, that was a sensuous thing. You just choose to make everything water. But the idea, of course, like that you are reducing everything to that's still an idea. In these passages, Hegel stresses that entities postulated for the sake of explanation of phenomena are thoughts, not things. At the first glance, one can read them together with Hegel's critique of the use of other entities postulated in sciences as similar to what instrumentalists say about scientific theories. The latter also deny that unobservable entities referred to in scientific theories exist as independent entities, and although this is not their preferred way of expressing themselves, they could say that these entities are just thoughts that enable us to better categorize and predict observable phenomena. On this reading, Hegel becomes surprisingly similar to certain empiricists and positivists who likewise criticize metaphysics smuggled into sciences. Yeah, and this is fair. If Hegel's saying, look, all you can say is this, you can really get to is the sensuous world, and everything else is sort of like abstract. That is not that's not actually that's a respectable position. Instrumentalism, plenty of instrumentalists still around. They say, look, all of our science is just a very useful fiction, and it's maybe not real, but like this is the best story we have, and this is what we do until we get a better story. And all the stories in science, they just keep going. Eventually, we're going to find out our current story is slightly wrong, and then we modify it. But that's fine, because we didn't actually know. It wasn't the hard truth, but that's the history of science. You revise, and that's cool. All right. However, a closer look at the longer of the passages just cited should alert us to the premature character of such an interpretation. Hegel does not suggest to keep all metaphysics away from science, but only bad metaphysics. As in the passages quoted earlier, he characterizes this metaphysics of the understanding for fixing one-side thought determinations and turning them into things. To this metaphysics, Hegel opposes his own metaphysics of the concrete logical idea, which supposedly does not reify thought determinations into things and recognizes their status as mere moments of the larger whole. The point is not that, say, atoms do not exist, and that the statements about atoms should properly be considered as mere tools for predicting observable phenomena, as would be the case for instrumentalists. The point is, rather, that atoms do not exist as separate things, but are instead conceptual moments of material bodies. The same goes for other unobservable entities, or at least for those of them that actually capture some aspects of the phenomena under investigation. Okay, so this is, I think I understand what's going on here. This is really abstract. Maybe the author's going to say it. But this is one of these things where, I've heard, who is it? Zizek. Zizek has said this, and he's a Hegelian a bit. He says, look, in like a video game, you don't load levels that you haven't gotten up to yet. But when you get there, the world sort of like gets its act together, and then, then the level exists. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. The world doesn't actually exist. It's not real until we get there, but it becomes real when we do get there. And so in some sense, the world exists in interaction with us at that time. And when we get to that point in the world, only then does it start to like become concrete. But that's like part and parcel of like us getting there. So it's like we exist. It doesn't exist as a separate thing in the world. It exists as we get there, as part of us getting there, is what makes it real. Okay, so let's see what the author says. But all of this sounds very abstract at this point. It is still not clear how exactly we should understand Hegel's point that atoms and other entities postulated by theories are mere moments and not independently existing things. In order to give a better sense of what Hegel means when he says that something is merely a moment or an aspect of material bodies that can be considered in abstraction from them, I will now provide a brief reconstruction of Hegel's discussion of the mechanics section in his PN and of the transition from mechanics to physics. Once we understand the relationship between the different levels of abstraction from the full-fledged account of material bodies in Hegel, we can also grasp Hegel's position with respect to the unobservable entities postulated in the science better. Okay, so this is the work of what's going on now. So, yeah, who knows what the hell is going to happen, but if you keep in mind, I think the Zizek is actually kind of interesting at this point. It's that the world is being created when we get there. And it's real, but it wasn't real in some sense before us. It's real when we observe it. And so in some sense, it's one of these perturbation theories. We can only like experience the real world by like messing it up. But like that messing it up is what it is to be the real world. So the uncertainty principle, like to observe something, you're changing it. But like that's everything in this case. It's not just like little bits of physics that it's very important for, but this is the entire universe, is that when we get there we sort of mess with it, but like that's how it exists. It exists to be perturbed by us. And that's sort of like the video game thing too. If you know about like video games, the world doesn't exist until you get there. The level just isn't loaded because it's a waste of time to load a level that you're not anywhere near. Okay, but let's see what Hegel says. And do I have anything to call this yet? I don't know where we're going. Like, frankly, I have no idea what's going to happen. So, if you have any questions, let me know. The basic concept of mechanics. Hegel starts the argument of the mechanics section, and indeed PN as a whole, with the characterization of nature as the idea in the form of otherness or in the form of being outside of itself. Hegel arrives here via the notorious transition from logic to nature, which I cannot discuss here. In section 254, he identifies this feature of nature as space. He then makes a series of transitions to the concepts of time, place, motion, and matter, the basic concepts that lay the foundation for the discussion of both finite mechanics and the absolute mechanics. The details of Hegel's transition between some of the basic concepts are rather obscure. Fortunately, we do not need to dwell on every detail of these transitions. Rather, I will focus on the general relations between these basic concepts that transpire from Hegel's discussion, as well as on the most important transitions. Hegel rather clearly characterizes these relations at the end of the discussion on of the basic concepts, in addition to the section 261. Space is not adequate to its concept. Consequently, it is the concept of space itself which procures existence for itself in matter. What the fuck? Whatever. People have often begun with matter and then considered space and time as its forms. What is correct in this is that matter is the reality of space and time. However, here, space and time must appear first for us because of their abstractness, and matter must then show itself to be their truth. Okay, so we may actually be getting a relativity theory, where the space is relative to the matter, and that is kind of what is being said before. Like, there has to be something that engages with the space to make the world real. If there is nothing in the space, then it doesn't exist. And if you go back in history, actually, this is not a new point. Leibniz was in an argument with Newton about absolute spacetime, and Leibniz was holding that spacetime is relative, well, space is relative, and Newton, of course, held that space is absolute. And Leibniz won the argument in some sense abstractly. He won the metaphysical argument by saying, look, if space was absolute, then there would be space with nothing in it. But that would mean God would be wasting God's time by making empty space. So the space must be relative to what was in it. And Newton actually, conceded the metaphysical argument. And so this is kind of what's going on here. Matter must show it to be the truth of space and time because they must be interrelated in some way. God would not waste time making empty space. Just wouldn't bother. So, this isn't so far out of what was going on in the discussion in the literature at the time. Okay, here we see that for Hegel, the concept of space is the first in the order of the conceptual development because of its abstractness. However, for the same reason, this concept is underdetermined, and for its full determination requires new concepts such as time, place, and ultimately matter and motion. Space thus becomes intelligible only in the context of matter in motion. The general idea behind this seems to be this: since space is something in German, it has parts that are outside of each other. But if these parts are outside of each other, they should also be in some way distinct from each other. However, because of the abstract character of the concept of space, we initially cannot make sense of this distinctness. There is nothing that can be said of one part of space that would differentiate it from any other part of space. Space, considered by itself without anything that would fill it, is completely undifferentiated. Thus, something else is required if space is to conform to its own concept, that is, for its parts to be distinct from each other as they should be. As will become clear soon, this is not possible without matter and motion. Yeah, and so I think this is like a step up from the Leibniz. It's saying not just must there be matter, but there must be observable matter. And if it's not moving, it's going to be like a flat background. You won't be able to see it. So I think this is what it is. It's that you need to have something relatively moving, like moving in a relative fashion to actually show that the space is space. Okay, similarly for Hegel, time is not a substance that exists over and above the changing material things. Rather, he expresses this in his lectures. Time is only insofar as there are things, matter indeed insofar as they are finite, that is, have an end, are negated. Time is only insofar as there are things, so that time is only an aspect of things. This is abstract intuition. Time is thus merely an aspect of finite, changeable things. Hegel calls this an abstract intuition, but he is explicit that this does not mean that time is something merely subjective, not belonging to things as they are in themselves, as is for Kant. Time is, just as space, a pure form of sensibility or of intuiting the non-sensuous sensuousness. However, as it is with space, the distinction between objectivity and the subjective consciousness distinct from it does not apply to time. So Valpo asks the very important question: so if a tree falls and no one sees it, it doesn't exist? No, it cannot exist. It's not that it doesn't exist; that it never fell. So, because how could it have done a falling? The falling itself, actually, taking your question very seriously, the falling actually would make it exist. But if it could not fall on its own, then the space would be undifferentiated, and it would be abstractly, it would be undifferentiated, and it would just be pure space, and therefore too abstract. So yes, but the falling is what does it. Okay. I am sorry. Hegel's concept of time is that of negative unity of the being outside of itself, that is, negative unity of space. Because of its negative character, time involves change or negation of some state of affairs. But since at that point only the concept of space is available in addition to that of time, the latter must involve negating some spatial state of affairs. That's the falling. The time must show that the falling takes time is what it would be. And since the falling takes time, then you have then shown it's taken over a different spatial area. That would be the time that like the tree fell over time in space. And that's what the spatial state of affairs is. This reference back from time to space leads Hegel to new concepts that synthesize both of them, those of place, motion, and matter. We should now sketch the relation between these concepts. So yes, the tree falling means that there's a relation between the pencil and the falling, and over time, and the location in time. So you've got T1 is here and T2 is there, and the relative motion in between is what is how you determine time and change in space. So now the question is, why would we accept that the tree falls without anyone seeing it? What does it mean for a tree to fall if there is no human to determine that there is a falling? And this is a more difficult question. Is there no falling if there is nothing that no agent that would understand it as falling? Because maybe there's some things out there that would not actually understand a tree falling as falling. Maybe they wouldn't recognize it at all. So does it have to be a human agent actually at that point? But there's a different question. The concept of place captures the point just made. The negative character of time has to consist in exchange in space, whereas previously space was considered in abstraction from time and therefore from any change that may or does happen in it. Hegel's concept of place overcomes this abstraction. Place is space insofar as it is subject to change, space temporalized, or the unity of the here and now. The concept of motion represents another side of the same coin. It is exchange that occurs in space, time spatialized. This passing away and self-reproducing of space in time and of time in space, so that time posits itself spatially as place, but this indifferent spatiality is likewise immediately posited as temporal is motion. So yeah, this is all I was saying before. Like, if you want to talk about motion, you need to be able to represent time and space in different ways relative to something that's changing. And so this is all it is. You can only talk about the change as a change over time in space, and where it is in different places. So yeah. So these transitions are relatively intelligible. The next one, however, namely the transition to matter, is extremely terse and occurs in the sense following the last quote. However, this becoming itself is equally the internal collapse of its contradiction, the immediately identical existent unity of both. Matter. Wow, that made no sense. It makes sense to call matter the unity of place and motion, since it both occupies space and is or can be in motion. It also makes sense to say that matter is Dasein, some sort of being, something that exists or is there. The transition to matter must still be clarified though, and Hegel himself signals its difficulty immediately after making it. The transition from the ideality to reality, from abstraction to concrete existence, here from space and time to reality that appears as matter, is incomprehensible for the understanding, and thus this transition always appears to it as external and as something given. And this is the question of what I mean. What does it mean for something to say something fell? We see things fall, right? Well, maybe not. This is a discussion of metaphysics. We see things fall, but it was the tree that fell, not us seeing it fall. So, but if we are not there, as Valpo said, if there is no agent, did the falling occur or did something else occur? And that is the hard question of metaphysics in some sense. Where is the falling, or is there some other change going on? And that's what it means. Like, how do you, and if you're going to call the falling something that happened in matter, well, falling is already us, in the Kantian terms, that is already us applying our concept to the world. And so if you want to say, well, the falling happened in the world, but falling is something that we do. That's an idea of ours. And so this is why it's very difficult. These guys did not have the, I don't think, had the conceptual tools to actually ask this, not at least till Frege. And then you got sense when you had sense and reference in Frege. Can you talk about this more specifically? But that's getting into the weeds of analytic philosophy. Okay, but this is the problem at this point. But that's how do you get to matter from motion, and you're not going to get there very easily. Okay, author says, I believe that Dieter von der Schneider correctly points out that Hegel's transition to matter is indebted to and should be understood against the background of Kant's first analogy of experience, where Kant argues there must be something persistent that underlies all change. Hegel's point is similar. If there is motion, there must be some underlying substance in space that moves, that is matter. Okay, so they had some sort of metaphysical relativism there. This is not the end of the story, though, since matter is not just an underlying substance that moves. Hegel quickly goes on to specify the moments that matter has, namely attraction and repulsion, while criticizing Kant's account of these in the Dynamics chapter of the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. The categories of attraction and repulsion are, in fact, moments of the category being for self in the logic, and Hegel characterizes matter as being for self in some chapters and in the main text of 262. In his discussion, he implies that this feature of matter, or rather just the moment of repulsion, correctly corresponds to its ability to exclude other matter from occupying the same space, the same place. Some commentators take this parallel with the logic as somehow explanatory of why matter has these moments. On my view, the relationship between these parts of Hegel's system, this should not be the case. The explanation should be internal to the philosophy of nature. However, we can distinguish between two kinds of explanation that are at play here. The first is the explanation or justification of the transition from the more abstract, underdetermined categories to the richer and more concrete ones. The second is explanation in the opposite direction that renders the category intelligible in light of still richer categories, showing how the category under discussion is itself a moment of the richer conceptual context. I will now discuss the first sort of explanation for the introducing the moments of repulsion and, to a lesser extent, attraction. Later, I will have something to say about the manner in which matter's characteristics captured by the category of being for self is a moment in the richer conceptual framework of what Hegel calls physics. Okay, so we're getting really deep in the woods here with Hegel. I'm not sure what's going on, but it's basically saying, look, we've got different levels of abstraction, and once you get more details at like the more concrete part of the world, then you can talk more about the abstract ones because you have more details about what they're doing. Okay. In addition to arguing that for there to be motion there should be some substance that moves, Hegel makes the further point that this something must be such that it occupies space, excluding other things from it. In the book, Kant moves from the characterization of matter as simply something that can move in space to the point that it occupies space and excludes other matter by successively applying different categories from his table, from the first critique to the empirical concepts of matter, first quantity, then quality. Hegel characteristically wants to say that one determination actually follows from another. There cannot be matter in the sense of something that is able to move without that matter being able to occupy space and exclude other matter. Now, what is Hegel's argument for such a claim? His text does not help us much, so we have to reconstruct it. Falkenberg makes a sensible suggestion to the fact that, for Hegel, material things are distinguished from each other through their relative motion, and in order for this to work, they must have non-overlapping trajectories in time and space, which amounts to them not being able to occupy the same space and time. As she points out, in quantum mechanics, at the micro level, the concept of their particles' impenetrability loses its sense for the same reason, namely because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, as their determination by means of definite trajectories in space and time. And this is what I think I brought this up earlier. This is what's going on. You need to be able to interact with these things, but in the interaction is like the important stuff. And this is what's going on. If you can't interact with the world, then you don't actually experience the world and it's not real for you. Now, where is the realness in the world then if it's in our interaction? That's a question. But is it in the matter or is it in our interaction with the matter? We don't know. But we'll find out what Hegel has to say. All right, so definite trajectory in space-time, which demonstrates the close connection of impenetrability of matter with its localizability. There seems to be something right about this after all. After all, it's precisely the inability to distinguish the parts of space that started the whole dialectical development, so it is sensible that the concept of matter must make a contribution to solving this problem. Our previous discussion suggests that parts of space are differentiated by means of bodies that can occupy them. However, it seems that, at least at this point in the mechanics, bodies themselves can only be differentiated by their relative motion. For this differentiation to work, though, non-overlapping trajectories seem to be required. I mean, yeah, if you've got two non-identical particles, but they're like two hydrogen atoms, and one is here and one's here, if they aren't like moving, then which one is which depends on your point of view. But if they are moving in like circles or something different, then you can be like, all right, the one that's making a figure of 8 is that one, and the one that's moving in a circle is the other one. But like, that's the thing. If they were moving in different trajectories the whole time, then you can do it. But if they're just hydrogen atoms floating there, which one's which kind of depends on where you are, and then they have no individual reality themselves. So that's why relative motion is required here. So if one's going in this way and one's kind of making an 8, then you can always figure out which one's which by their relative motion. Okay. However exactly we interpret this argument, it is now clear that the abstract concepts of space and time are, for Hegel, and in opposition to Newton, only moments of the richer concepts of matter and motion, and depend on the latter for their full determination. I believe that this means for Hegel that there cannot be time and space without there being material objects in motion. As he puts it, matter is the reality of space and time, or their truth. Similarly, it is first in motion that time and space now have actuality. In fact, at one place Hegel compares the concept of absolute and relative space, a clear reference to the Newtonian distinction, and claims that, whereas the absolute space is merely the abstraction of space, the relative space is, however, something higher, for it is the determined space of some material body, and the truth of the abstract space is rather to exist as a material body. With respect to time, Hegel is even more explicit. Time is not something like a container in which everything is put into a current that flows and by which it is dragged forward and down. Time is only this abstraction of consuming. Because things are finite, they are in time. It is not because they are in time that they perish, but rather the things themselves are temporal. To be like this is their objective determination. Yeah, so again, where are we in time? Well, we're in time because we die, and so we have a determinate like lifespan, which is our time. And so you get this in other places too. You get this in like the existentialists. You have only the time of your life. That's what's most important. But like in this is that time is a property of things that change. And so you need to have change in the thing in like the course of our life for time to exist. So, or again, like I was saying, time only exists as so far as this pencil is changing in its location. But time is a derivative from the change in location in space as it moved through space. Okay. It is difficult not to see a similarity between this account of the relation between space and time on the one hand and the material bodies in motion on the other, and Leibniz's account of space and time developed in his correspondence with Clarke as an alternative to Newton's account. Yeah, and this I knew from the history of science. So, while Hegel might not have accepted Leibniz's rather empiric account of the formation of our concept of space and time, at least the order of ontological priority seems to be the same for both. Space and time depend on material objects in motion. Yeah, and I bet I wonder what footnote 24 is. Okay, it's at the end. I wonder if Hegel was aware of the Leibnizian argument against Newton's account based on this, because this was in the air at the time. So, in Hegel's own terminology, spatiality and temporality are the most abstract natural properties of material objects. Because they are most abstract, Hegel considers them first. This consideration shows, however, that they are only intelligible within the context of material bodies that occupy places and are in motion or at rest. And at rest would only be the stopping of the motion, so it would be relative to the motion. Thus, the simple abstract properties of spatiality and temporality depend on the more complex and concrete framework that include the properties of being a material object, being in motion or at rest, and occupying a place. In this way, Hegel begins elaborating the conceptual structure of material objects, starting from their most abstract properties, progressing to the more concrete ones, and showing the dependence relation of the former upon the latter. He continues to do so in the further parts of his philosophy of nature. In the next section, I will argue that this framework of matter in motion that Hegel now identifies as the concept concept of inert matter is, according to Hegel, itself only an abstract moment of the still richer concept of gravitating or heavy matter, and thus the former is only intelligible in the context of the latter and dependent upon it. I wonder if this is just talking about mass, like as we know it, the gravitational mass, but we'll see. Okay, but yeah, we're in like weeds, and so if anyone has questions, let me know. But I have it looks like if we're getting past this relative motion stuff, who the hell knows where Hegel is going to go with this? Okay, in the chapters Finite Mechanics and Absolute Mechanics, Hegel mounts a number of further criticisms of Newton, some of which are misguided. For the purposes of my discussion, though, the important issues is the relation between the two concepts of matter, the one expounded at the beginning of the chapter Finite Mechanics, according to which matter is passive and inert, and the other fully articulated in his Absolute Mechanics, according to which matter is active and self-moving. As some scholars have argued, both of these concepts of matter are implicit in Newton, the first concept in his first two laws of motion, the second in his law of universal gravitation. These concepts are also at odds with each other if taken to express the essence of matter. Hegel argues that the concept of inert matter is subordinate to, indeed is an abstraction from, the concept of active matter, in a similar way that space and time are merely abstract moments of matter in motion. Hegel expounds the concept of inert matter in some chapters. In 263, he introduces the notion of the body, which at this point means no more than matter of a particular quantity limited in a specific space it occupies by excluding other matter from it. In the physics section, Hegel will enrich this abstract concept of the body, and I will say more on this later. For now, the body, understood in this abstract way, is conceived as indifferent both to space and time, in the sense that it can occupy different parts of space and exist at different times, not being tied to any specific one, and to their synthesis, that is, motion. It is therefore conceived to be inert, so that its states of motion or rest are determined by something external to it. Hegel clarifies this conception in some German word as follows. In physical mechanics generally, the body is taken in this determination so that it is an axiom here that a body can only be set in motion as a state of the body through an external cause, and the same goes for bringing a body to rest. Okay, so this is interesting, is the concept of inertia, and I guess that's what they were talking about, Newton's laws, that like a object at rest will stay at rest, and if it is in motion will stay at motion, but like that would be an external cause. Okay, no sooner had Hegel expounded this concept than he pointed out that it is an abstraction, not yet a fully developed concept of matter. In this sphere, the finitude of the body, its inadequacy to the concept, consists in the fact that matter it is only posited as matter as the immediate abstract unity of time and space, not as a developed restless unity for which motion is imminent. Alright, so yeah, because the idea of inertia on its own is nothing. Like, it's just a concept. But that's what I think he's saying here. But this merely immediate and precise, merely immediate and precisely because of this abstract and finite corporeality. The body as body means this abstraction of the body. However, the untruth of this abstract existence is sublated in concrete existent bodies, and the positing of this as sublation begins already in the selfless body. Okay, so I think this is just saying, look, matter has inertia, but the inertia doesn't exist without the mass doing something. But like its selfless body, if there's inertia exists, but without the actual mass holding the inertial mass, then it doesn't really doesn't have existence. Okay, author says, I will now outline the second concept of matter and show in what sense the first one is the abstraction of the second. I will then briefly outline Hegel's dialectical critique of the concept of inert matter, which he uses in order to move towards the concept of self-moving matter. In spite of his criticism of Newton, which caused many scholars to severely criticize him in turn, it is important that Hegel neither rejects Newton's laws of gravitation nor diminishes its significance. He says that universal gravitation as such must be recognized as a profound thought, and that it is recognized that the substantial moment which Newton added to the content of Kepler's laws is the principle of perturbation, the principle whose importance should be mentioned here insofar as it rests on the proposition that the so-called attraction is an action of all individual parts of the body qua material. So Hegel recognizes and praises Newton's deep thought that all material bodies attract each other, for it is because of the planets and satellites attract each other and not only attract and are attracted towards the sun, that there are perturbations in their orbital motions, that is, deviations from Kepler's elliptic orbits. Moreover, Hegel believes that gravity is essential to matter and that it expresses its true concept. Gravitation is the true and determinate concept of the material corporeality that is realized as the idea. Okay, so again, this is the perturbation theory, where everything has to like interact with each other in order to. This is how we also see the world, and I think this is what's going on. Our seeing the world is in some sense interacting with the world, perturbing the world. This is what we're getting with the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And so I think what's going to happen here is that we've got gravitation as a metaphor, not gravitation in the scientific sense, but gravitation as a metaphor for this more general perturbation theory of, what is matter? It is to interact in a perturbing way. We'll see, though. But that might actually be where we're going. Gravitation as metaphor. I'm going to write that down. I like that idea. Let's see if I'm right. Gravity as mind. Oh, dear, I'm off by a little bit. Let's see if I can... Can I just grab this and move it? What did I do? I don't even know how to use this. That does not work. Okay. Whatever. I'll screw... I hate this. I don't want to, overwrite chat. I'm sorry. This one. I can't do it. Interesting. What am I doing? I'm losing my... Oh, man. Now I'm screwing my stuff. So I'm gonna have to reset the damn thing. What is going on? Why did that pop up? That's amazing. All right. So there we go. Gravity is the metaphor for mind, that everything is interacting with each other. Of course, he wouldn't have known about non-interactive particles that didn't have that, but that's fine. Okay, so gravitation is the true and determinate concept of the material corporeality that is realized as the idea. And so this is where I think we're going, right? It's this stuff right here. Boom. Okay. Let me drink too. I'm getting very hot. Yeah, he might ruin everything. But, yeah, that's alright. I mean, the fact that he gets everywhere into everything is very impressive. Alright. But if it is essential to matter that all parts attract each other, matter is not in fact indifferent to motion, as it is supposed to be according to the concept of inert matter. Rather, all bodies tend to move toward each other because of their nature or their true concept, and so matter is self-moving. So, yeah, if everything is gravitational, then everything attracts, and they move towards each other. Even human-scaled bodies attract each other, although their mutual attraction is weak enough that it is not noticeable. It is not noticeable by us in our everyday life. Planets, their satellites, and the sun provide a much more spectacular demonstration of the motion caused by gravity, and not by some external force applied to them. And so Hegel writes, gravity immediately contradicts the law of inertia, for in virtue of the former, matter strives out of itself toward another. So that's interesting. He's saying, look, that all this stuff is moving, and so why is it all moving? Well, it's not the law of inertia. Must mean that something else is going on here, because gravity seems to have already been set in motion. And so how did it get set in motion? How did this gravity happen? And this is actually a hard question in physics. The history in physics is very hard to actually understand, because if you have like these systems like this, there can be like physical properties of the systems that only exist when things are organized a certain way. And this one is, the example is like if you spin water in a glass, like the swirling, it'll change the shape of the water, like it'll go up around the sides. And so if you, in some sense, you can't know, and if you stop swirling and the water keeps going, why is the water in that shape? Well, there's no way to tell in the history, because if you have only looked at the glass after the glass stopped moving, but the water's still going, you can't find out. And so I think that's what's happening here. He's saying, look, what set all this motion, the gravitational spinning around each other? It's not given by inertia, and so inertia can't be fundamental. A physicist might not find this contradiction between the laws of gravitation and inertia all that worrying, but she might say that the law of inertia expresses a counterfactual situation in which a body is considered in complete isolation. However, I believe that this response basically concedes Hegel's point. The concept of matter captured by the law of inertia is merely an abstraction from the true indefinite concept of material corporeality. In fact, in Something, Hegel says of inertia precisely that it is absolutely valid only for matter as singular bodies, and indeed for those absolutely only insofar as they are singular bodies. Yeah, so inertia only, like all other physics, only makes sense under the right sort of abstractions. And this is the problem. If there's an actual history to the world, then it is no longer an abstraction. And this is the problem I just brought up with the concept of physical history and our interpretation of it. Because if there's physical history, then you can't get a law out of it. It's not in the proper kind of abstraction. Okay. Now, Hegel does not simply contrast the two concepts of matter, the inert matter and the active self-moving matter, but argues that the latter is philosophically superior to the former, and indeed that a careful analysis of the concept of inert matter leads us to see its inadequacy. For example, Hegel argues that only the concept of self-moving matter is capable to successfully explain why there is motion in the world at all. For if we accept the concept of inert matter, we must say that for every given moving body, its motion is something external to it, and thus imparted to it by something else. If it is imparted by another, the same reasoning can be repeated with respect to it. Thus, the reasoning leads back to the infinite regress, which does not end up answering the general question about the existence of motion as such. This is going back to the Big Bang, saying, look, where did everything come from? It came from the Big Bang, but then we can't explain the Big Bang. It is thus no wonder that mechanicists who operate with this concept of matter and often end up referring to God as the first cause of motion. Yeah, whatever started the Big Bang, you can call that God if you want, or whatever it was, the unmoved mover, call it what you will. By contrast, the concept of active matter can answer the question about the origin of motion without reference to supernatural causes, but rather by reference to the nature of matter itself. Yeah, so if everything is moving, then it doesn't need to have a start because everything can move on its own. But the question is, how did it, where is this, inert, this essential moving thingy that get into everything then? The author's primary point in this section is that in the metaphysics and the mechanics section, Hegel progresses from the more abstract concept of the inert matter to the more concrete active matter. The concept of inert matter is true only of bodies in isolation. That's kind of like an abstraction, a physical one, in isolation from all other physical bodies. Concerned as individual bodies, not as systems of bodies in their own right, which is to say that is never quite true of anything. Again, Hegel first considers the simpler concept of matter, according to which material objects only occupy space and can be in states of motion or rest, with respect to which they are indifferent in the sense that the kinematic state of a body cannot be explained by reference to the nature of the body itself. It can only be explained by citing some external cause. Yeah, what set off the inertial motion? What set off its inertial motion? Hegel then purports to show that bodies can be in motion or rest are only fully intelligible in the context of the more concrete framework that ascribes the property of universal gravitation to matter. Yeah, so this is so Hegel's saying, in some sense, if you don't want to do the regress, you have to give everything a sense of gravity. And then, the question is, where did everything show up from? But that's a different problem. But then everything can be spinning around itself. The fact that it started off with gravitation means it can just do that. Where everything came from, I guess Hegel is not worried about right now. Thus, Hegel further elaborates the conceptual structure of material objects, showing the dependence of their properties of being at rest or in motion upon the more complex property of universal gravitation that is ascribed to systems of bodies. I will now argue that for Hegel, a similar relation obtains between the subject matter of the mechanics section of the PN as a whole and the subject matter of the physics section. The former considers bodies only insofar as they are spatio-temporal moving objects that occupy spaces by excluding other bodies and strive to their center of mass for reasons that have to do with their spatio-temporal properties alone. Other properties of bodies that are not reducible to their spatio-temporal characteristics are discussed in the physics, and it is bodies which possess all those properties that turn out to be the fundamental objects in the inorganic nature on Hegel's account. Oh, what the hell? Okay, I have no idea. But let's see. We're on page 9. I want to see how much longer this is going because it's taken forever to get through Hegel, unsurprisingly. Yeah, we have to get to page 12. We're on page 9. We'll make it. And as Valpo says, Hegel ruins everything, including philosophy roulette. But that's why it's roulette. Sometimes you get the bullet. Mechanics and physics. Before proceeding, let's retrace Hegel's main line of reasoning so far and relate it to some other historically important accounts of matter. Descartes took extinction to constitute the essence of matter. Hegel has started with extinction or space and argued that by itself it is something that cannot be intelligible without reference to other concepts such as time, place, motion, and matter. Descartes' conception of matter was also criticized by philosophers and scientists before Hegel, for example by Newton. Many of them explicitly or implicitly subscribe to the concept of inert matter. Hegel considers this concept as well, shows that while it is more concrete than concepts of matter that equate it with extinction, it contradicts the law of gravitation if gravity is considered essential to matter, and argues that it should be so considered. He thereby argues that the concept of inert matter is likewise too poor and abstract, ultimately unintelligible except as an abstraction from a richer concept of gravitating matter. And I mean, he's calling it gravitating, but it's sort of like interacting matter is basically what it is. It has to have some sort of physical motion interaction, and that's what gravitation is standing in for right here. However, Hegel does not stop there. He argues that even the richer concept of active gravitating matter is still not sufficiently concrete to be coherent. A full discussion of the nature of bodies must involve an account of multiple physical properties or determinations that are not reducible to the mechanical ones. The longest part of his PN physics is devoted to the discussion of these properties. Here I cannot consider the details of that discussion, which in any case is less general than argumentatively tight than that in mechanics, or Hegel's arguments for specific transitions in physics. Rather, I want only to indicate the general dependence relation between Hegel's mechanics and physics. I will suggest that, as before, the more abstract framework of mechanics, rather than being a reduction base for the richer framework of physics, as it was for mechanical philosophers, it's in fact explanatorily depends on the latter. So he's sort of flipping things around here. You need to get to the more everyday as an explanatory thing for the abstract. All right, here we go. I'm not entirely sure about all this Hegel stuff because I don't know the structure of Hegel's writing, but let's see if we can figure out what he's saying. What Hegel himself says about the transition to physics in the main text of the encyclopedia is not particularly helpful. He writes, for instance, so we're reading something that's not helpful. Great. The form appears at first in its differentiation in the ideal determinations of space-time and motion, and accordance with its being for self as a determinate center outside of the matter that is outside of itself. However, in the developed totality, this self-externality is posited as simply determined by this totality, and matter is nothing other than this being outside of itself. In this way, the form is materialized. Considered in the opposite way, in this negation of it being outside of itself in the totality, matter has itself attained the center which it formerly only sought, itself, the determinateness of form. Its abstract and subdued being in itself as general heaviness has been resolved into form. It is qualified matter, physics. Wow, that was great. As far as I can see, here Hegel is simply stating without an argument that while earlier in the mechanics the form of matter only consists in different forms of motion, it now consists in the qualities of matter, while matter itself becomes not merely spatio-temporal, but qualified. However, here Hegel does not provide any motivation for the transition to the consideration of new qualities or properties that are not reducible to determinations of space, time, and motion. Given the historical prominence of the mechanical philosophy that aimed to reduce all natural phenomena to matter in motion, one would expect Hegel to explain why even a mechanical account that includes active gravitational matter is insufficient. An explicit discussion seems to be lacking in his text, though. Yeah, I mean, if you're just going to declare that things have properties and that's how they are, that's fair, but like, if you're in the tradition that says you can't do that, then you can't do that. What I suggest is that Hegel believes the account of matter offered in the mechanics section to be essentially incomplete. A number of properties that figure in mechanics are considered there only insofar as their role in the motion of matter is concerned. However, they are not intelligible without a still broader context. For example, I have previously discussed Hegel's argument that matter has a determination of repulsion. Bodies occupy space by excluding other bodies from it. This feature of matter also plays an essential role in the discussion of impact in the finite mechanics. Moreover, in that discussion, Hegel considers an elastic collision in which bodies are compressed but then restored their volume when the pressure upon them is lifted. The immediate reversal of these two sides is elasticity. What is soft is also repelling elastic. It recedes, but only so much. It cannot be expelled from a place. So does the being for self of matter appear to us, by means of which matter asserts itself as internality, which is also called force, against its externality, which here is being for another, that is, being of another in it. Okay. However, Hegel actually analyzes the category of elasticity only later in the physics section. And even if specifically elastic character of collisions is meant only as an example, occurring as it does only in the addition, it is still true that the capacity of matter to exclude other matter is left unexplained in mechanics. To be sure, Hegel argues, or at least one can try to reconstruct his argument in this way, that matter must have this property if bodies are to be distinguished from each other, but nothing more is said about elasticity at that point. Historically, the property of impenetrability or solidity was sometimes simply posited as primitive. Kant has argued in the MFNS against this dispensing with explanations and provided his own explanation in terms of the repulsive force, one of the fundamental forces that constitute matter on his account. In his mechanics, Hegel has rejected this Kantian construction of matter out of fundamental forces. If we look at just his mechanics alone, it might seem that he has returned back to those accounts of solidity which dispensed with any explanation for it. But this is not Hegel's usual procedure for the categories that occur in his system, although the various empirical features of nature that are not fully determined by such categories are left unexplained by him in accordance with what he calls the impotence of nature. And indeed, Hegel returns to the consideration of matter's capacity to repel other matter in the discussion of the category of cohesion in the physics section, the chapter Physics of Particular Individuality. There he says, in cohesion, the immanent form posits spatial existence of material parts alongside each other in another way from that which is determined by the direction of gravity. Thus, this specific mode of coherence of the material is first posited in that way, that which is different in general and yet has not returned to the self-enclosed totality, its shape. Therefore, it appears only in opposition to likewise different, indeed coherent different masses, and thus displays itself as a particular mode of resistance in its mechanical responses to other masses. Alright, so basically you're still just positing that things, they expand, they repulse things, they're elastic, and they push things out, and then they go back to what they were. But that's just a declaration of how things are, not an explanation of it. So it is only in the context of cohesion, of the interconnectedness of the parts of a body, that its resistance against other bodies becomes intelligible. In the 1825-26 lectures on the philosophy of nature, Hegel in fact includes an explicit consideration of elasticity in his analysis of the category of cohesion. Alright, so there's some internal property, but that's still not explanatory, it's just an internal rigidity or elasticity. Now, it seems that Hegel offers an explanation of the resistance of matter to other matter of a different sort than offered by Kant. Whereas Kant explains it by reference to the forces that constitute matter, Hegel points out that for there to be resistance, there should be fully constituted bodies characterized by their specific weights, cohesion, and ultimately chemical properties. In mechanics, though, we do not yet have fully constituted bodies. It is Hegel's physics that offers an account of the categories and the relations, the totality of which is needed for an explanation of the properties of the body. Hegel's explanation, then, is not in terms of the real underlying constituents of matter, whether they be forces or mechanically interacting particles, but purely conceptual, in that it tracks the dependence relations between various properties of the material body. In particular, Hegel seems now to be arguing that purely mechanical properties of the body depend on its further physical and chemical properties. Alright, so now we've got abstract mechanical properties, is basically what it is. And I think this is why we're getting to chemistry. You're going to start to put elasticity onto a chemical reaction here. And this is where I think this is kind of a little bit more interesting. How does elasticity chemically represented? Well, elasticity, I'm sure, can be done in many, many ways. It's going to be multiply realizable chemically. And so what Hegel, I think, here is doing is sort of trying to get this sort of concept of how things are moving, but not getting the specific chemistry or physics of it, but is going to say, well, these are the fundamental concepts of like things that are actually the what the physics needs to have, those fundamental concepts. Okay. While Hegel does not say these things in so many words, in his lectures he does point out the abstract character and insufficient determination of matter insofar as it is considered only mechanically. Thus he writes there, "This is the transition from the mechanical sphere to the physical sphere, which is posited by means of the development of the form and its various determinations. The fact that matter manages to become form means that form and matter are one and the same, that matter now exists as qualitative. The mere matter is merely doing a thing of thought, or any matter is qualitatively determined. Thus we step into the sphere of actual reality." Okay, so I think that's what's going on, is that you're saying things are like elastic, but you're not actually saying how the physics is underneath, but you know that the physics is making an elastic reaction, because elasticity, like the shirt has some like spring to it, there is something in the physics, that in the chemistry of the cotton, that makes it springy. And so I think this is where he's going down to. He's saying, look, we're getting down to the base concept of what the physics and the chemistry is actually doing. Okay. Only bodies characterized by the categories developed in the physics are real, while the merely mechanical matter is just an abstraction. Yeah, so things that are merely springy are abstractions, but the ones where you get down to the physical springiness are real. The mechanical properties of the bodies can be fully determinate and intelligible only in the context of the categorial structure developed in the physics section of Hegel's PN. Now, if Hegel thinks that mechanical properties of bodies depend on such non-mechanical physical properties for their full determination, it stands to reason that he should not accept the explanations of the latter that are couched completely in terms of mechanical properties. And indeed, Hegel rejects all attempts to reduce all physical, in his sense of this term, properties of bodies to their merely mechanical properties. For example, as we have seen at the beginning, he famously criticizes Newtonian mechanistic account of light and colors. Similarly, he rejects the explanation of the difference of specific weights in terms of different amounts of empty space in different bodies. This seems to support my interpretation of the relation between the categories of Hegel's mechanics and physics. Okay, so I guess this is why he's anti-reductionist, because I think this is the idea of the multiple realizability of things. There are more than one way that this shirt could be springy or stretchy, and so the fact that you're saying this is the thing that is making it stretchy, that's wrong. It's getting down to a concept of stretchiness that is exactly realized by the underlying physics, but you can't say what the stretchiness is actually made up of based on our understanding from our perspective of that the shirt is a little stretchy. If these considerations are on the right track, then the relation between Hegel's mechanistic and physics mirrors the relation between the categories of space and time and those of matter and motion, as well as that between the concepts of inert matter and the concept of self-moving gravitational matter. This approach thus seems to be at work throughout Hegel's account of inorganic in nature, where at least wherever that account worked out. Okay, and I was wrong. That's not where we went. We went to so this is boom. This was wrong. Yeah. So what we have done here is we've gotten ourselves to some sort of concept of the limits of our conceptual analysis in terms of reducing down to whatever we can conceptually get to, and then after that it's all the physics. And that's what the physics is doing exactly, but the physics can't exactly align with it because we don't actually know what the physics is doing. It could do it more than one way, it looks like, and that's why it's silly to put all these metaphysics onto what is going on there. Because how do we know about whatever liquids are underneath? You only know the end result of it. Okay, conclusion. Let us now see how this reconstruction of what I take to be Hegel's main line of thought in his account of inorganic nature helps us clarify his position on the problem of scientific realism and his critique of unobservable entities postulated in science. We've seen that in Hegel's account of inorganic nature, the fundamental objects are not mechanically interacting particles or bits of matter, but rather objects that possess the full complement of mechanical, physical, and chemical properties conceptually related in a certain way. Yeah, so you've got the whole thing that somehow makes the stretchiness, but the whole thing is underlying. It somehow is realizing the stretchiness, but we don't talk about it because we don't know what that is. We only know the stretchiness. Hegel's conceptual development in philosophy of nature leads him to the conclusion that the fundamental objects in his ontology must have this sort of conceptual structure. What corresponds to the objects with such a structure in our perception are, in fact, the objects of our manifest image. Yeah, so the shirt is stretchy. We have that. Their physical and chemical properties are not accounted for in terms of mechanical interactions between the constituents. Moreover, Hegel neither provides nor deems it desirable to provide an explanation of these properties in terms of the microstructure of the objects, even if it is understood to be not purely mechanical, as in today's explanation of, say, chemical properties by reference to the atomic and molecular structure of different substances, ultimately in quantum mechanical terms. Hegel's classification of chemical elements, for example, relies on the identification of their roles in various chemical reactions rather on their microstructure. In light of this, it can be said that, for Hegel, successful mechanical explanations of natural phenomena are neither their accounts of appearance in terms of the really existing postulated unobservable objects as they would be for scientific realists of his time, nor are they just useful tools for coping with or predicting appearances. Rather, they refer to the properties of matter considered in abstraction from the conceptual structure of physical objects that relate to their various properties to each other and articulates the dependence relation between them. Yeah, so for him, whatever the physical properties of the shirt are, it has to relate all the way back to the stretchiness of the shirt. So you can't talk about this stuff outside of how we are interacting with it. So he's more of an interactionist than the other people are. So it's not an instrumentalist, it's calling the things fake. It's an interactionist saying you have to get the dependency structure all the way back to our manifest image, which is how we see the world. Okay. For Hegel, the structure and properties of the inorganic material body is articulated by the interrelated conceptual structure, such that the various nodes in this conceptual structure, or in Hegel's language, determinations or categories, correspond to the respective properties of the body, and the sequence of transitions between the categories corresponds to the dependence relations between their respective properties. Thus, in accordance with my account above, the more abstract properties of the body, such as being spatial and being temporal, depend on the more concrete property of being a material object capable of occupying place and being in motion or at rest. Furthermore, the relative abstract property of being an inner material object for Hegel depends on the more concrete property of being a part of a system of objects that gravitate towards each other. Finally, the whole set of these mechanical properties depend upon the still more concrete physical properties, such as specific weight, specific heat, certain magnetic and electrical properties, such as well as their chemical properties. It is because Hegel accepts this account of the structure of material bodies that he consistently criticizes the idea that material bodies are reducible to or are nothing but collections of unobservable mechanical particles. More generally, Hegel is critical of all attempts to conceive of something that, for him, is only a moment of his fully developed conceptual structure of matter as an independently existing constituent of matter. For example, as we've seen, Hegel rejects postulating separate stuffs as substrates for heat and sound. Now we can see that he does so because this would involve himself, hypothesizing what for him is merely a moment of the concept of material body that reflects some of its properties. The same can be said of Hegel's critique of atoms, conceived in a mechanistic fashion and used as a reduction base for explaining the more concrete properties of the bodies. For Hegel, this amounts to imagining objects that possess only the properties which cannot exist in isolation from the more concrete properties that the bodies that we encounter in our experience possess. Right there, they said it. More concrete bodies, this is all comes down, cannot exist in isolation from the more concrete properties. So it's all coming back to what we can do with it in some sort of that thing, in the everyday life. Thus, we can see that Hegel indeed defends the priority of the manifest image over the scientific image, as Sellars has correctly identified. It seems to be safe to say, though, that the particular way in which he does this is quite original, if not unique, in the history of philosophy. Alright, I don't know if this is actually unique, but saying you have to relate everything back to the way we interact with the world, that is not a crazy thought. And it's nice that we're getting somewhere with Hegel, that we're finally saying, okay, we do understand what Hegel was saying, and it's not stupid. And so I like the idea that it's not stupid, that if you want to talk about the stretchiness of the shirt, or the physics of the shirt that is making up the shirt, then you can go all the way down to the microstructure, but at that point you have to sort of stop, because what you're looking at is the stretchiness, and you don't know what is causing the stretchiness specifically. But you can say, look, it is stretchy at this point, and at that point is going to be some sort of physical or chemical structure of the cotton that this shirt is made of, and maybe whatever else is in it that gives it a little bit of stretchiness. And that is what the real stuff is. But it cannot exist in isolation from the more concrete properties that is the stretchiness. And so all the things that we're postulating, it still has to come back to how we are interacting with it. That's okay. And that's an okay way of characterizing what we do in science. Well, what do we do in science? Well, we have these experiments and they study the world, and we learn of things, but you can't separate what we learn of from the things. You can't separate what we learn of the world from their experiments. And this is a holistic view of science. And that's not a crazy thought, all right? So I like that. If anybody have questions about this, though, I think I've been talking an hour and a half on this, and I know I'm probably killed everyone out there, but I like the idea that Hegel comes around in the end to something that I think is not a stupid idea. And given the quality of science at his time, he may have been working with this stuff, so doing the best you can. Of course, he had his own ideas, and he deserve a lull. So yeah. Hegel. Why Hegel? Can't you just say, look, everything has to come back to the concrete, our interactions with reality. You knew the word interactions. You knew what everyday reality was. You could just say everyday reality. And I'm being completely unfair to the history of philosophy here. But the concepts we use now to describe things only have meaning now in the way we mean it now, and it makes everything a lot easier. And that took a lot of work. And you're always why couldn't they have just said what they meant? Well, the fucking words didn't mean the same thing back in the day, and if you said that back then, they would look at you like you had 3 heads. But you do wish that it was a little bit easier. But yeah. So we read that paper on Hegel a little while back on affluenza. That was fun. This one is on science, and Hegel's coming off as non-crazy. I like that. So, it's cool. Okie dokie. Any last words on the motherfucker?